welcome everybody to the Science from the Fringe podcast with Bryce Nickels, and I'm Professor Jay Bhattacharya. We have with us today my good friend, Dr. Marty Makary of Johns Hopkins University, who's a surgeon, a best-selling author, and also now a movie star, if I understand correctly. Welcome, Marty, to the podcast.
Good to see you guys.
Today, I thought we'd bring Marty on because he was in a new movie. Bryce, you are also, if I understand correctly, a movie star in the movie.
I'm featured in the film, Jay. I don't know if I'd consider myself a star. I have a few lines. The film is called Thank You, Dr. Fauci. It's made by Jenner Furst, who's an award-winning documentary filmmaker. The way Jenner frames this is he's investigating the origins with a couple producers of his. I think it's Lee and Attica, I think are their names. The film begins with Jenner sending an email to Anthony Fauci because he is trying to, reach out to him to get some comments because he's investigating the origin of COVID. And so that's where the name of the film comes from, because he signs it, Thank You, Dr. Fauci. I think the film, I've publicly said the film's great. It's available only right now for streaming. It's on a website. You have to go to the website. It's exclusively there.
I just talked to Jenner, the producer. They are being heavily censored. I mean, on social media, on Meta, on multiple different platforms. He said it has just been massively downthrottled. It's as if there are massive forces out there working to make sure nobody hears about this movie.
I mean, you can see why, right, Marty? Because like the indictment of Dr. Fauci's role in the causing the pandemic is just hard to escape. At the very least, that there was like a massive cover up of decisions that were tremendously irresponsible, and it includes some very sort of well known reputable people, including people that are close to Dr. Fauci. I mean, I thought, for instance, that Robert Redfield, the former CDC director, comes across as quite believable in the movie. And what he says is absolutely shocking. That the beginning of the pandemic, that he saw in the evidence base that it was likely that this pandemic started from a research program that Dr. Fauci had pushed forward. Even through like a lot of opposition or in 2010, 11, 12, through a whole pause in the gain of function research support by the NIH, Dr. Fauci had persevered and pushed for the kind of research. And when you had Robert Redfield telling Dr. Fauci and others that this is probably a lab-generated virus starting in the Wuhan Institute of Virology, they pushed him aside pretty brutally.
I was told I need to talk to Dr. Robert Redfield. He was the director of the CDC at the time of the pandemic.
He's the highest placed person who's been outspoken on Fauci.
Patient has had long COVID since 2020.
His whole career got turned upside down from the pandemic, and now he's back practicing as a doctor and specializes in long COVID.
And currently being treated with antihistamine. My own view is that this virus was not of natural origin. It was an act of scientific arrogance.
He's blamed in the early days for a lot of the problems with the pandemic. But then there's other reports that say that he told Fauci that this was most likely a lab leak, and he was excluded from all these secret teleconferences that were happening.
He's also a colleague of Fauci's for 40 years. It's incredible.
And then in 2018, they get put in the same orbit again when Redfield gets appointed to be the director of the CDC.
One of the reasons I accepted the CDC job is that I have 12 grandchildren, and I just have a very strong premonition that our nation is going to have a terrible, terrible pandemic.
They pushed him aside pretty brutally. And it was interesting. I mean, it's just shocking to see the sort of machinations going on behind the scenes. And you could see this, and I thought the film does such a good job of doing that. I think anyone that sees it is going to think they'll get their blood boiling. My blood was boiling.
This film does a great job of, putting out there for the public, like, this man is not a hero. He's done a lot of harm. And I don't even think that they talk at all about trying to give him any, laud him for any of the stuff he's done. I think time and time again throughout his career, he's just been what seems to be like this narcissistic egomaniac. It's my way or the highway. Now you have a pandemic that likely was caused by gain-of-function research, something that he had been promoting for decades. Moving Redfield out of the top spot is really something that I think has been overlooked from a historical standpoint, because Redfield himself brought that up at the COVID select hearing, and it's sort of been buried until this film.
That was a good part of the movie. I mean, the dynamic, the sort of interpersonal shove, how Fauci iced out Redfield, kept him out of the key meetings, even on virology, which, of course, Redfield is a virologist. He's been an HIV research colleague of Fauci and these other guys for a long time.
So it's an interesting film that it has several scientists in it, including myself and Marty and Jay. You do have a cameo, I will say, although you weren't interviewed for the film. You do have a cameo.
Question, Bryce, did I have more time on screen than you, or did you have more time on screen? I mean, I did not take a stopwatch, so it's hard to tell.
I think people were more excited to see you, Jay, than they were to see me. Let's just put it that way. Regardless of our time, I think people were much more excited.
I think, just for the record, for everyone to know, Bryce had more screen time than me on the film. I was there for a very short while.
Well, there's always chance for Jenner to correct that mistake, Jay, because we know who should get that screen time.
Well, if it doesn't get good reviews, they'll probably go back and recut it and put more of Jay in it, and that'll boost up that'll increase the star power.
We may need to reshoot some of the film, put Jay into sort of every scene, like he's just in the back. Marty, you were saying that the film is being heavily censored, correct?
Meta, YouTube, Google, Reddit, Amazon, through their, I guess, web services platform, and PayPal have all worked to block this film. PayPal, which I guess is, just for the payment to purchase the movie on the website, they've initiated some sort of investigation into, whether or not they can do this. And so it's just been uphill with every single social media, corporate big tech entity out there to get Americans to not watch this movie. It's unbelievable.
Well, we do know that the Biden administration has used its regulatory power over social media companies and other entities in order to censor Americans. I mean, Marty, I'm pretty sure you were subject to that. I know I was subject to that. And Bryce, I think a lot of the discussions about COVID origins also were subject to that same policy. So it's not at all surprising that the Biden administration might use its power to do that against this movie. I mean, I think the question is, why is the Biden administration still using its leverage to protect Dr. Fauci and his reputation? Why is that a major goal of the Biden administration's policies?
He's still the golden boy, Dr. Fauci, of so many communities in the United States that have sworn a political allegiance to maintain political apartheid in America, so that scientists who believe in a lab leak are separate. They're separate but equal, maybe not even separate but equal, but they do not go to the same panels. They are not invited to the same editorial boards. They don't have the same rights in publishing and in science. It's I don't know if you saw this. This is delicious. Did you guys see this? Rochelle Walensky just last week receives the Anthony B. Fauci Courage and Leadership Award from the Infectious Diseases Society of America.
I'm frankly stunned. I mean, I suppose it does take some measure of courage to say things that are entirely contrary to reality confidently, and know that you're going to somehow fool half the country into believing that you're right. And Rochelle Walensky, I think, fully deserves an award. I mean, in some sense, it's quite fitting that she get an award with his name on it.
Marty, you were talking about the first time you noticed that Dr. Fauci was a little bit off, which related to how he did a photo op with the first or with that nurse that was brought over from Africa. Do you want to just talk about, like, when did you first recognize it was something not so heroic and compassionate about Dr. Fauci?
Well, I'll even go as far, Bryce, to say when I first became suspicious of Dr. Fauci and his motives was during the Ebola outbreak when a nurse in Dallas, Texas, contracted Ebola. She was a healthcare worker, and she was on respiratory precautions. Now, that's standard. We know respiratory precautions. There's respiratory precaution. There's a room for respiratory precautions at every major medical center. It's not like the respiratory precaution room at the NIH hospital is better than the respiratory precautions room at University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center. So she was there recovering from COVID. Of course, there's basically no treatment that they were giving her.
Ebola. Sorry, you're coming from Ebola.
Ebola.
Same thing, frankly. I mean, Ebola, COVID, it's almost this. At this point, you probably...
So she's got Ebola, and there's nothing to do, just supportive care. They're just watching her. There's no treatment they're giving her. There's nothing unique. There's no anecdote they're getting from grinding up a monkey in Africa, like in the movie, Outbreak, the movie Outbreak.
Did they really ground up a monkey there in that?
Yeah, just magically. They have some magical serum, So they're doing basically nothing. They're just letting her recover. And Fauci insists that they fly her up to the clinical center in Washington, D.C. from Dallas.
I'd like to close by making an announcement to this committee because I'm sure you'll hear about it soon in the press. This evening, tonight, we will be admitting to the Clinical Studies Unit, the Special Clinical Studies Unit at the National Institutes of Health, Nina Pham, otherwise known as Nurse Number 1. She will be coming to the National Institutes of Health, where we'll be supplying her with a state-of-the-art care in our high-level containment facilities.
Exposing countless people in the transport to Ebola. And then Fauci puts on an astronaut suit along with a photographer and goes into this room where she's recovering, and they get a photo op. And so right there, they get a great photo and it goes viral. Then the NIH has a press conference showing how the NIH has all these capabilities and has all of these beds and nurses, and all of the care is free. And one person, a reporter in the audience, astutely says, wait a minute, when you say it's free, isn't it funded by billions of taxpayer dollars? And, that kind of threw a monkey wrench into their argument.
She is where she is because she is sick and she needs care.
Can you specify estimate how much it costs per day to take care of her and who will cover the cost? What if you would take in 10 or another person
Okay.
in the next few days?
This is a research hospital, and I've been at the microphone. I'm going to give Dr. Gallen the chance. Everything is free in this house. John, why don't you explain this?
So when I said there's no other hospital like it, we've never billed a patient for anything. We will travel them here if they need money. We will house them or their family when they're here for free, and we never send a bill. So this patient will never be charged for anything.
What would the cost be for taxpayers?
The public pays $402 million a year to run this hospital through the generosity of the taxes, and we manage that budget.
Okay.
So they decided to fly an Ebola patient up from Texas to DC or wherever this is, Bethesda, for a photo op with Fauci?
All I can say is there was no clinical indication. There was no medical justification for transport here. And I know that they got this photo op with Fauci in the spacesuit.
So Marty, in the movie, it presents a pretty incredible picture about the lab leak, but it doesn't present all. I didn't think it present all the evidence on the lab leak. Before and we were talking in the green room about this, you said that there's more evidence that you've seen that's in some ways even more persuasive to you that it was actually a lab leak. Would you tell us about that? Because it seems to me like there's one of these things where it's essentially no longer just a scientific question, it's like a criminal investigation, and so we have to apply the standards of that to this question rather than, because the Chinese won't release the data. The NIH is redacting everything it possibly can. You have FOIA lady making sure that we don't get to see things. What have you seen, Marty?
Well, if we look at the totality of evidence, it's pretty clear. If we can use common sense, scientific logic, and deductive reasoning, the circumstantial evidence is overwhelming. Consider this. The world epicenter was 5 miles from the lab. A patent on the COVID vaccine was filed in February of 2020, before the lockdowns in the United States, by a Chinese scientist who had worked in the Wuhan lab, Dr. Yusen. He mysteriously died a few months later. An intelligence report in the U.S. intelligence community identified infected lab workers in the fall of 2019. The lab submitted a cookbook, the recipe on how to make COVID-19, in 2018 to the United States government. Anthony Blinken wouldn't release it, but once it became public, it was a cookbook. It said, we want to take a bat coronavirus and insert a furin cleavage site so it can infect human cells. I mean, this was the recipe. I mean, and one thing I think we all know in academics is that when you apply for a grant, you actually do about half of the research or get it started before you even submit the grant or before you even get the award. That's a well-known in academic research. China destroyed all the records and the samples and this large virus genetic database that they worked years to create. They destroyed it immediately. The top virologist told Fauci they believed it came from a lab before the so-called big ask in the film, which was fascinating. I didn't know about that. China arrested the first doctors who treated COVID patients and threatened them. The first doctor actually died, even though he was young and healthy, months later. A lab leak happened before. It happened in 1977 in China. That's now well documented. And this same lab basically failed a U.S. inspection just before COVID, where it was described as having horrific conditions comparable to that of a dental office. You look at all of these things, and we still have people like Dr. Collins still saying he thinks it came from the wet market. Not even the Chinese think it came from a wet market anymore. They've abandoned that idea. But this is the power of political propaganda. And a lot of people don't know a lot of these facts or what's in this movie, which is why I can't wait for this to be public and people to watch. Thank you, Dr. Fauci.
But if you wanted, I guess the origin stuff is just so absurd. It's like the science that's been published on it is laughable. I will say that the one person who may have the best explanation for a natural origin is actually Sunetra Gupta, who spoke at the conference, who said basically all the papers that connect it, all the papers claiming a natural origin, those are just garbage. There's a joke. But she thinks it was circulating, percolating in nature for a while, and then just like magically popped up at the market.
Or outside. She didn't just say the market. It could have been also popped out outside just to see it, yeah.
The discussion about the origin of SARS-CoV-2 rotates around two equally implausible scenarios. Either that the virus was manufactured in a laboratory in Wuhan, or that it jumped out of a dish of pangolin chop suey somewhere nearby. What is far more likely is that the virus had already been circulating over a period of several months in China and only came to light in Wuhan. Just because we found it in Wuhan doesn't mean it came from Wuhan.
But the key thing is that you have virologists publishing what are just laughably horrific papers in the top journals and pretending like that's not, like these papers are so bad. I just can't reiterate how embarrassing they are. And the virology community is pretending that that's okay.
What's striking about that, Bryce, is that the virology community, I think, correctly understands that the kind of support that they've received to do the kind of dangerous work they've done, many of them have done, is in danger. If people generally understand, and the scientific community generally understands, that it's likely that their activities caused the pandemic, right? So they correctly understand that. The strategy, though, if I were advising them, is to say, look, it's not all of virology, which is true. It's not all of virology which is dangerous. There's a lot of virology which is necessary, good, and worth doing. It's this part of virology, this like, let's go find viruses in bat caves, bring them into city centers, put them in, sort of low security labs and like weaponize them. That's what's dangerous. That's what's bad. That's what we should no longer be doing. They should be cleaning their own house. And then rather than trying to like sort of circle the wagons, lie about the evidence, publish bad papers, and then go do devastating takedowns of anyone that criticizes them. If they'd done that, actually, then their field could survive. Instead, what they've done is they put themselves in this position where it's like all or nothing almost. Like the stakes are so high now. Cooler heads need to prevail here. Like it's very clear that even if you don't fully believe this is a lab leak, that this kind of work, weaponizing viruses. I remember Simon Wain-Hobson, who's also at the Stanford conference, mentioned this to me. He says the analogy would be to put an antibiotic-resistant gene into anthrax to make it so that anthrax is not treatable by antibiotics. And it's just, why would you do that? Like, that's not science. That's just folly.
But don't you think there's a culture, and we've seen this deep in the web of the research community, of just because you can do something, you should. Like, if something is doable scientifically, we should just do it. And they don't understand what it means for the public or what the risks are. It's just, how many studies, like, I remember in my college, they had a bunch of labs, and I would ask them, like, what are you doing? Well, we're identifying dolichal esters. Well, they're already known. What are you noticing about that? Well, we're trying to find out the ratio in the Golgi versus the cytoplasm. Okay, why does that matter? Because it's constantly changing. Well, somebody could use this information someday to maybe cure diseases. It's like the space program, right? Like, what are we doing in space? Well, we're going to find scientific cures for diseases in space that we can't find in medicine. Okay, what cures have you found? Well, we invented Tang. It's just like there's this feeling like we just need to do everything. And it's a little bit like what Oppenheimer in the film learned the hard way, is you got to consider the risks. The Wuhan lab leak was the greatest industrial accident in the history of the world and the greatest liability case in the history of liability. So, of course, the people that had a hand in at least promoting this type of research were giving money to the lab, not directly to the test tubes and agents that may have been involved in this, but it's just embarrassing that they were. They have decided to undergo this massive cover-up, and regardless whether or not it came from the lab, I believe it did, the cover-up was preposterous, and that is now what's all in clear daylight.
To your point, Marty, of the idea that scientists think they can do whatever they want and it's always valid because it's this, drive for knowledge, that's like baked into the culture of science. I think I kind of feel like that's part of the training. You don't get ethics. You're not ever asked, what is the impact? Like, does this experiment have any impacts that might adversely affect others?
There's this idea that the Bryce and I have been popping around with Simon Wain-Hobson about this Hippocratic Oath that scientists could take, right? Just as doctors take in principle should take an oath to say that they will first do no harm to their patients. Scientists should take an oath if they're moral, that to say that the scientific work that they will do, they will not do where they will that the work they do will not harm the people that they're studying or harm the public generally at large.
My wife is a pediatrician. My son is an interventional cardiologist. They've taken a Hippocratic Oath. They could do harm. But as a virologist who's thought about this, I could conjure up some really nasty stuff that you really wouldn't want to know about. And no Hippocratic Oath. So I think a Hippocratic Oath for life science PhDs, pretty easy, fairly easy to do. Stanford could start it tomorrow if they wanted, I'd imagine.
I mean, that kind of idea where there's this like ethical obligation to scientists to sort of think about the broader impact. I mean, often it's really hard to predict, right? You have some scientific advance, you don't know exactly how it's going to be used. That's understandable. But you're working on something where you stick something into a virus to make it more transmissible and deadly to humans. I mean, come on.
What could possibly go wrong?
So Marty, one of the things I saw in the film that you talked about that was quite striking was the loss of trust in minority communities about public health. And I'd love to hear you reprise that. So you don't have to give everything away, but so people go see the film. But like that, tell us about that.
Well, look, many minority communities in the United States have good reasons to be distrustful of a medical establishment, especially from the government, that says, we're here to help you and trust us. The medical establishment was injecting syphilis infections into Black men as part of the Tuskegee experiment, and then let it run untreated into late stages, disabling and doing terrible damage to the brains of these individuals. It went until the 1970s. I mean, this is in our lifetime that we've seen these cruel experiments done in the name of science. And, also up until the 60s, some say into the 70s, was the so-called Mississippi appendectomy, where they would take African-American women, often poor people from impoverished communities, and sterilize them without their consent, without them even knowing. They would be in there for an appendectomy or some other procedure, or they would be tricked into surgery, and then they would tie their tubes or remove their ovaries or something like that. I mean, again, this is, we are one generation away from this being common in the United States. And so the white community may have forgotten about this, but the African-American community has not. And so when the government says, hey, we're going to mandate that you get a new vaccine, guess what? They're a little skeptical, and they have a right to be skeptical and to ask questions.
Can I play a clip from a documentary that was put out by PBS? And it's, I don't even know how to describe this. There's essentially Dr. Fauci walking around Washington, D.C., I think in January 2021 or December 2020, right after the vaccine's been developed. And he's walking around with the mayor of Washington, D.C., a woman named
Muriel Bowser. Yeah.
Yeah. And he knocks on a door, kind of like a vacuum salesman or something. And they're talking to an African-American gentleman. And this just needs to be seen to be believed. So let me put that up for us to look at.
The people in America are not settled with the information that's been given to us right now. So I'm not going to be lining up taking a shot or a vaccination for something that wasn't clear in the first place. And then you all create a shot in miraculous time. It takes years to create vaccination.
Well, it used to take years.
Okay, it used to.
You know how many years were invested in this approach? About 20 years of science to get us to be able to do it.
20 years is not enough. And 9 months is definitely not enough for nobody to be taking no vaccination that you all came up with.
The only reason I'm talking to you right now, as close as we are, is that I've been vaccinated.
Right.
But if it allows thousands of people like you don't get vaccinated, you're going to let this virus continue to percolate in this country and in this world.
Something like the common flu then, right?
And it's
much more serious than the flu.
Well, the flu kills a lot of people annually, too.
You know how many people died of the flu the last year? I mean, not this year, virtually none, but the previous year, about 20 to 30,000. You know how many people have died from COVID-19 in the United States? 600,000 Americans.
Well, the number that you all giving that died, that's once again, that's you all's number.
You gonna pass?
Yeah, definitely. Because when you start talking about paying people to get vaccinated, when you start talking about incentivizing things to get people vaccinated, there's something else going on with that. Something else going on.
It is something going on.
There's something else.
You're right. But I'm glad millions of people like me and most everybody here didn't get an. You know what their incentive was? Protecting their health and protecting the city. But I won't keep you anymore.
It's okay, because my incentive, y'all campaign is about fear. It's about inciting fear in people. You all attack people with fear. That's what this pandemic is. It's a fear. It's fear, this pandemic. That's all it is.
Okay, Marty, first of all, that African-American gentleman that Tony Fauci was talking with, who was more close to correct on the science?
I mean, here's an everyday guy. I think they were in Southeast DC, a community I know well, and just an everyday guy. They knock on his door, and his instincts are more accurate than that of one of our nation's top public health government doctors. He says basically 9 months is not enough, right? And then he just completely disarms Dr. Fauci when he says, well, maybe 20 years is not enough. Dr. Fauci didn't have a response. Then he said, he's a young, healthy appearing gentleman who has a extremely low risk of COVID mortality. And he basically says this is like the common flu, which, for him, his individual risk profile, he's closer to the truth.
And Fauci responds with a non sequitur. Yeah, a lot of people died from COVID. The question isn't that. The question is, what's his risk? And what impact will the vaccine have on him? And Fauci can't answer that it's going to reduce his mortality rate because the randomized trials didn't look at the mortality reduction effect of COVID.
As you have said perfectly, Jay, is that one of the primary failures of the medical establishment during COVID was the failure to recognize the 1,000-fold risk difference between an older individual and a younger person. And then you add a comorbid condition, it's a 10,000 or 100,000 risk difference, right? So he's got an incredibly low risk. He has concerns about the vaccine, understandably. And he says the numbers of how many people have died, he says, that's your old numbers. Well, that's what I've been saying, and you've been saying, I've been saying it in the Wall Street Journal op-eds, that how many people died from COVID versus an incidental positive test on a super sensitive PCR machine. And then he says something else is going on here. And this guy, within seconds of this surprise visit from a knock on his door, his instincts are spot on that there is something else going on here. I mean, it's delicious.
Did you notice at the beginning of the clip, Mayor Bowser says, the only reason I'm standing anywhere close to you is because I've been vaccinated. What she's saying is he's unclean. And the only reason that she's willing to get even as close as she did, like 6 feet away from him, is because she has been vaccinated. And so she's no longer scared to be as close as she was.
And then what changed? Like today, would she come within 6 feet of him? Because COVID still circulates. So on what date did she suddenly feel comfortable being next to unvaccinated people?
The last bit where he's saying, look, this pandemic has been about fear. The whole thing has been about, you know what? That's absolutely spot on. That's absolutely spot on. And it was Tony Fauci who leaned into that. Like I remember a clip of him talking with Rand Paul in the Senate, where they're talking about the risk to kids. And Rand Paul correctly points out that the risk to kids of COVID infections in 2020 is pretty low. And then Fauci brings up a very rare thing that sometimes happens when children get COVID. He called it the Kawasaki's-like syndrome. At that point, there were like 4 cases of it, very small number of cases of it in Italy, and all the kids recover. And he's like putting that in the minds of parents that you should be, even though your kid might not die, they're going to get this weird Kawasaki's-like syndrome that you never heard of before.
With regard to going back to school, one thing that was left out of that discussion is mortality. Shouldn't we at least be discussing what the mortality of children is? This is for Dr. Fauci as well. The mortality between 0 and 18 in the New York data approaches 0. It's not going to be absolutely 0, but it almost approaches 0. Between 18 and 45, the mortality in New York was 10 out of 100,000. And I think the one-size-fits-all that we're going to have a national strategy and nobody's going to go to school is kind of ridiculous. We really ought to be doing it school district by school district, and the power needs to be dispersed because people make wrong predictions. And really the history of this, when we look back, will be of wrong prediction after wrong prediction after wrong prediction, starting with Ferguson in England. So I think we ought to have a little bit of humility in our belief that we know what's best for the economy. And as much as I respect you, Dr. Fauci, I don't think you're the end all. I don't think you're the one person that gets to make a decision. But if we keep kids out of school for another year, what's going to happen is the poor and underprivileged kids who don't have a parent that's able to teach them at home are not going to learn for a full year. Well, I think it's a huge mistake if we don't open the schools in the fall.
I have never made myself out to be the end-all and only voice in this. We don't know everything about this virus, and we really better be very careful, particularly when it comes to children, because the more and more we learn, we're seeing things about what this virus can do that we didn't see from the studies in China or in Europe. For example, right now, children presenting with COVID-19 who actually have a very strange inflammatory syndrome, very similar to Kawasaki's syndrome. I think we better be careful if we are not cavalier in thinking that children are completely immune to the deleterious effects. So again, you're right in the numbers that children in general do much, much better than adults and the elderly, and particularly those with underlying conditions. But I am very careful and hopefully humble in knowing that I don't know everything about this disease, and that's why I'm very reserved in making broad predictions.
He leaned into panic mongering throughout the pandemic, and this gentleman had picked that up. I mean, he very clearly had picked that up.
One other thing I was going to mention is it's remarkable. If you look back 4 years ago, right around this time, half of the medical establishment was so angry. They had blamed the fact that we had not beaten COVID on the fact that President Trump was not wearing a cloth mask frequently enough. If only President Trump would wear a cloth mask more frequently, he could then be a better example for other people to wear a cloth mask, and then we could finally beat this pandemic. And they were so livid over that with no scientific support, that the New England Journal of Medicine broke from its 208-year tradition of staying staunchly nonpartisan to endorse Joe Biden for president, with all 31 editors signing on, saying that the current course was unsustainable. And you look back on that groupthink, right? It's remarkable. It's just amazing. Of course, they could have done a study on community cloth masking, but they didn't, right? They chose not to do it. Instead, it was easier to pick your political enemy and then just rally people to have blind allegiance to this political narrative.
Okay, so while we're talking about groupthink, this is a great segue to your book, Marty, which has now been on the New York Times bestseller list for a month and a half.
New York Times is purveyor of misinformation.
No, but the thing is like this one piece of reality is not actually misinformation. The New York Times is accurately reporting that Marty's book is fantastic, and that many, many people think it is, by the way, fantastic. Marty and I recorded a podcast, which we can put in the links if you want to see us talking more about the book. There it is, blind spots. The theme of the book, Marty, is groupthink among doctors mainly. First, tell us just give the audience a little bit about your book, and then tell us about what's happened. Like how is it that you managed to con the New York Times into like letting your book be in the top? You've outsold Tony Fauci's memoir, if I understand, and Hillary Clinton's new book.
The New York Times reporter who tweeted, "Someday we will stop talking about the racist theory of the Wuhan lab leak." She was not the book reviewer. The book is about the power of groupthink and how we have a herd mentality in medicine that sometimes engulfs smart people, gets them to sacrifice their independent thinking just to surrender total allegiance to the groupthink. And this herd mentality can turn into a mob mentality when somebody has a different opinion, whether it's the different opinion historically that it was sugar and refined carbohydrates that drives heart disease, not natural fat, something that ended up being true, or somebody who challenges the peanut abstinence dogma for young children, that was a dogma that ignited the peanut allergy epidemic. There are a lot of examples. Today, the biggest blind spot we have is that we are not talking about the root causes of so many of these chronic diseases and cancers that are on the rise. Early onset Alzheimer's, autism that now affects 1 in 22 kids in California, GI cancers in people under age 50, skyrocketing rates of obesity and diabetes right in our lifetime, skyrocketing rates of autoimmune diseases. All we're talking about is medicating and operating. Nobody is talking about the root causes. The root causes are right in front of our eyes. So is the NIH studying the role of our poison food supply and toxic and environmental exposures? No. The NIH has a culture today that is dominated by the influence of Dr. Francis Collins, one of the scientists who was part of that secret conference call with virologists where there was some big ask, and that was well documented in the film. He was actively a part of this Wuhan lab leak cover-up. And so Dr. Francis Collins is known for sequencing the human genome, or at least leading one of the 2 projects to do that through the government. And it's really been a culture of not just the NIH, but because the NIH funds academic research, a culture of modern medicine, a culture of academia, our culture in scientific research today, that the gene is at the root of all problems and the gene can solve all of our problems. And so you go to the NIH's website for one of their institutes called the Institute for Environmental Health, and you will see the director there has on his bio that he was involved in identifying an obesity gene. At the Environmental Health Institute, what is this? I mean, heaven forbid you actually get out in the environment. And in 2018, there was this big push under the Obama administration where Francis Collins was directing the NIH. He's had a 12-year tenure there. A program called the All of Us Research Program, which was designed to enroll 1 million American volunteers to donate their DNA through a blood draw to the government to do massive genetic experiments. Now, they promised that if there was useful information from their genome, they would share it with these people. So it sort of misled them to suggest that there would be clinical benefits to them from having this information. And they launched this giant American project in 7 cities with kind of a big rollout. Bands and gospel singers. They had one of the launches in a church in Harlem called the Abyssinian Church. They were in Birmingham, Alabama, actively recruiting African Americans for the study. All the recruitment materials said, we are going to finally stop the one-size-fits-all philosophy in medicine. We're going to customize and tailor treatments and individualize them to you because everyone is unique. They didn't mention in any of the recruitment materials that they were collecting everybody's DNA and genetic information. And so a lot of people signed up. Right now in America, the program is still ongoing. They have about 500,000 plus people who have enrolled. Hardly anyone has gotten any benefit out of giving their DNA to the government. But it's really amazing. They even got the granddaughter of Henrietta Lacks, who was the patient at Johns Hopkins who was mistreated many decades ago. They stole a part of her body, grew her cells in a laboratory, and companies have been selling her cells ever since and making billions of dollars from these cells while her family went into poverty. They recruited her granddaughter to basically say, to support this effort. It's really unbelievable. This is an ongoing thing by the NIH, but the NIH has had this culture that we will solve all problems through understanding the genome. And never mind the fact that there's junk food out there, there's environmental factors, there's toxins, there's poison in the food supply. None of that seems to matter or is on the radar. And the best example of this was when the water was diverted in the Gila River in Arizona from the Pima Indians, and the soil was destroyed. So the government, recognizing this injustice of settlers and ranchers diverting water, the government decided to send free food. And so but they didn't send good food. They sent processed food and processed flour and all this junk food, the sort of modern American junk food diet, no fresh produce. And so over decades, Pima Indians got a very high rate of obesity and diabetes, 10 times higher than the general population of the United States. They had an epidemic of diabetes and obesity. So what did the NIH do? They dispatched their genetic scientists to go down there and draw the blood of these poor Pima Indians to look for an obesity gene. I mean, that is the culture of the NIH, and that is the legacy. I mean, this is as recent as 1998 that they've been dispatching researchers to look for these so-called thrifty genes. It's like they can't see the forest from the trees sometimes.
Francis Collins, his big scientific advance is the Human Genome Project, right? We spent the 90s doing that, devoting vast chunks of the NIH budget to that. His idea of science is these big, all of science things where like vast numbers of scientists sort of are subservient to this one idea, rather than a distributed science where lots and lots of different scientists have different ideas, and they go at each other with their ideas, and they engage with different points of view. If you have a science that's that kind of decentralized, you can't have blind spots, because you're always going to be sort of in contact with people who disagree with you. Moving the NIH in this direction is just it's classic Francis Collins. Like all that matters is let's sequence the human genome. All that matters is let's go find the gene for cystic fibrosis. Let's go find the gene for X, Y, or Z. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. That's one point of view. What's wrong is like putting all your eggs in that one basket in science and hoping that that this is going to solve all of human health.
These poor Pima Indians for decades were being subjected to blood draws, and these NIH scientists came down, actually set up a clinic, which was like a genetics clinic, to just like draw their blood. They didn't need a genetics clinic. They needed fresh food and produce and not junk food. And it's like they cannot see the forest from the trees. 5 decades of the Pima Indians being suppressed and treated poorly by these NIH researchers with this false promise that if you give us enough of your blood, we'll figure out your DNA and be able to help you. They were not helped one bit. They quit the NIH participation 5 decades into it. They were treated terribly. Now, a lot of the doctors wrote dozens of research articles. Their careers were advanced with all of these sort of suggestions of maybe it's this and maybe it's this promoter gene. You know what? There was never a gene. There was never a gene. They were being fed junk food by the United States government. These so-called educated geniuses could not see the obvious, right? And it's not like this is, oh, that's ancient history. They're doing it right now. They were just in Harlem and Birmingham recruiting African Americans for the new NIH All of Us Health Initiative, which is a project to collect the blood and the DNA of Americans to, study them. And they are being, there's no fruit to show for it. What else could we do with that money? You could have amazing, healthy, organic food in every school in America, right? It's like they cannot see the forest from the trees.
There's a fantastic story in Marty's book about his Uncle Sam, who's from Egypt, and during the crazy days of the food pyramid, the American doctors convinced him to stop eating eggs. He has this egg recipe where it's like scrambled eggs with cumin, and it just sounds amazing. Anyone that just get the book Oh, yeah, there's Uncle Sam. Uncle, just get the book for Uncle Sam's egg recipe, you guys. But yeah. So, but then, like, in later, he's decided he's going to stop listening to crazy nutritional advice and just eat the eggs that he knew that were good and healthy for him from his youth. And now he's happier. Like you can see, he looks quite happy in that picture.
He just turned 93, Jay, this weekend.
Pretty good for 93. You got good genes, Marty.
Francis Collins will he might descend upon me and try to draw my blood and figure out. Yeah, careful.
Just
We'll cut that out because you don't want to be part of it.
No, don't cut anything out. This is fun.
Just kidding. Listen, I cut myself out, as Jay knows. Jay's the star of the whole thing. We talk about this all the time. No,
it's just unbelievable. All right. On that note, I think we shall end. Marty, I hope you come back because this was really so much fun to talk with you together with Bryce. This has been Professor Jay Bhattacharya on the Science from the Fringe podcast, speaking with Bryce Nickels and Dr. Marty Makary. Take care.